Well, I would like to begin by thanking Professors Mizukami, Matsushita, and Iyoshi for their very thoughtful and very thought-provoking presentations. And I took notes, and I'm afraid that even 10 hours would not be enough to address all the ideas that are now floating around in my head. But I respect your patience, so I will not try to address all the points that I took down. I will just take the most important one and try to keep it to actually 10 minutes. So both professors Matsushita and Iyoshi brought up a point that I'd like to start with. In her talk, Professor Matsushita brought up the hypothesis experiment and contrasted and compared, which, did I understand it correctly, was introduced in Japan in 1963? Okay. Well, it's almost before I was born. Not quite, but you know, it's I can take no credit for that breakthrough. And she compared and contrasted the similarities and differences. I think there are more similarities than there are differences, because even peer instruction, I use that very often in combination with experiments in the classroom. But the real point is that even before the hypothesis experiment, there were many other people who said exactly the same thing. I already mentioned Socrates, who 2,000 years ago said we should teach by questioning, not by telling. Likewise, Confucius, 1,500 years ago, not very far from here, said, and I have to read it because I keep forgetting the quote, he said, whenever 3 people are together, there should be one among them who can be my teacher. So you see, Confucius was actually the inventor of peer instruction, not Eric Mazur, right? The quote continues, I choose their strengths to follow and their weaknesses to ignore. Right? So in other words, you take the strengths out of the people around you, ignore. I don't know to what extent Confucius philosophies are taught in Japan, but maybe some of you were already familiar with that quote. So clearly, a lot of the ideas that we're discussing today are nothing new. They're old, older than all of us together, older than a lot of civilizations. So that really begs the question, why is change so difficult? And Professor Iyoshi had a whole slide about barriers to promoting innovation. Why, if 2,000 years ago Socrates said we should teach by questioning and not by telling, and we've had people throughout history saying over and over and over again that we should teach by actively engaging the learner, why is it that it is so incredibly difficult to change it? And I think there are 2 reasons for that. I mentioned one in my talk. I mentioned that the lecture is sort of a comfort zone. It's very easy to hide in this sense of false security you have in a lecture. Right? I mean, if you go to an active engagement lecture, and I'm very grateful to Professor Matsushita for pointing out the difference between active learning and deep active learning, because there are plenty of ways of being active, but have no important mental engagement, right? Just a very superficial one. So I totally agree. It should be deep active learning, not just simple active learning. So when you switch from passive to deep active learning, it's not that the students feel better after such a lecture. In fact, they'll have more questions. I have a colleague in the astronomy department, Phil Sadler, who studies education, who once told me a really interesting quote. He said, suppose that you're not a teacher of physics, but you are a tennis coach. You're coaching people to play tennis. And one day, you discover that the person you're coaching is not holding her racket correctly. Instead of putting her thumb like this, she has it like that. You go over to her and say, look, you should hold your racket like that, not like this, with the thumb along the stem, not curved around it. She changes her grip because she listens to you, and she starts playing, and all the balls fly out or they hit the net because she's not used to holding a racket like that. And she gets upset. She says, why don't you let me hold the racket the way I did before? I played better before I changed my grip. As a coach, you know that she will never improve her playing unless she changes her grip. And you tell her, wait, just wait 2 weeks, and you will see that you will play better. Because usually, when you change things, they do not improve immediately. They get worse before they get better. Now, that's pretty easy when you're coaching one person to play tennis. If you have 150 or 200 students in the classroom, and they all complain, it's very frightening. And you may think, oh, I must be doing something wrong. In fact, when I started implementing peer instruction, it was not that all students walked away happily. A lot of them were very unhappy. They were very unhappy for a number of reasons. For example, at Harvard, most students who come to Harvard already have taken a so-called advanced placement course in physics. This is a course that you take at the high school level, but it's a university level course. Most universities will then accept the credit for that course and waive the requirement to take physics at the university. At Harvard, that's not true. We have them take the course again. Now, unfortunately, the advanced placement course that is taught is very much a traditional memorization by rote course. So the students take this AP course, they get a 5 out of 5, they come to my class, they have to take all of physics again, even though, they don't want to. And now I start asking them questions in class, and they discover that they cannot answer those questions because they get confused by my questions. Some of the students will actually come to me after a few weeks and say, I like the questions you ask in class, but when are we going to do some real physics? They don't consider it real physics. And they get upset because they don't do well. They think they should get the right answer. They don't get the right answer. So rather than thinking, I must not have learned the physics well, they think there must be something wrong with Professor Mazur. Another thing that I notice is when I teach interactively, there are not fewer questions, there are many more questions. Normally I teach, as I told you already earlier today, I ask if there are questions, students are silent. If I use peer instruction, I ask them a question, they think, they commit themselves to an answer, they talk to their neighbors, they commit themselves again, we finish the discussion, and by then, Professor Mazur, what about this, and what about that? Lots of questions. It would be very easy as an instructor, and in fact, that's the feeling I had initially. I thought, oh my God, I confused my students. But I didn't actually confuse them. I started to put them on a path towards understanding. So I think it's very easy to retreat from initial negative signs and revert back to the safe comfort of traditional teaching, because nothing feels better than just delivering information and have everybody walk away happily, right? But I think that's not the only barrier. I think there's another very significant barrier. which we did not get to discuss at all. And unfortunately, it should probably be the subject of a whole other workshop, namely assessment. Students study not because they want to learn. They should, but that's not what happens. They study in order to pass the exam. So, to a student, it's the exam that's the most important part of the course, not the content or the skills or the syllabus or anything else. And unless we change the nature of our exam, we will never be able to change the nature of our approach to teaching. I believe that assessment is the silent killer of educational innovation. Now, Professor Mizokami, and I really like what you did there, mentioned the social constructivist aspects of teaching. And he pointed out, although this was not the words that he used, but that's what I made of it, that the traditional learning environment is completely different from the environment in which we typically function as human beings. You're sitting there right now, very much like students in a traditional class, and I'm standing here talking, and in a sense, it's a very isolating experience. I don't know what is going on inside your minds, because we don't communicate. I just give information at you right now. You don't know what is going on in the mind of the person next to you. We're all sort of isolated, non-communicating individuals, which in real life, we are not. In any organization, you continuously exchange ideas, talk to each other, refine your ideas by interacting with the people around you. Likewise, if you go to Google or any other search engine and you type in examination and you click on images, you will see pictures of rows of tables separated from each other with students all, you know, looking at the exam that they're doing. And again, I'm sure you all remember taking exams like that. You have this feeling of isolation of each other. And I think this is really important, this is maybe the only point I want to discuss briefly about assessment, is isolation from any source of information. Right? I mean, think about it, right? When you're taking an exam, you're not allowed to communicate with others, and you're not allowed to look anything up. Now, for those of you who have graduated from college, do you remember any situation in your professional life where you were cut off from other people and cut off from information? I think the answer is no. When we do our jobs, we can interact with everybody. We can look up everybody. When I write a publication on the interaction of lasers with matter, I can look up whatever I want. There's nobody standing next to my desk saying, oh, you're not allowed to look up that paper from your colleague by Yale. You should have known this by heart. No, I can look up whatever I want. So one thing I did, and I challenge you all to think about this for your own classes. What I've done, and I didn't do it in a single step. I took little baby steps, you know, every year a little bit more, is that I slowly decided to make my examinations completely open book, open access to information. Initially, I gave my students a sheet of information that they could bring to the exam. Then some students said, well, I would like to bring in my own sheet. I said, okay, you can take one piece of paper where you can write whatever you want. Some came and in microscopic letters, they wrote the whole book on one page. And then I said, okay, you can bring the book. And then 2 years later, I had some students who says, well, I would like to bring this other book rather than this book. I said, okay, bring this other book also. And then another student said, well, can I bring this book then? I said, okay, you can bring any book you want, right? And a few years later, I decided they can not only bring every book, they can bring their computers. They can use Google. They can use their smartphones. They can bring whatever they want. And I noticed that this had two big effects. The first one is that it tells the students in a very strong way that my course is not about memorizing information. This does not mean that you don't have to know anything, because you cannot just come to the exam and look everything up. There's no time for that. You still have to have the knowledge organized in your mind, and you have to know what the information means. So that was one effect. But the other effect was much, much more important. The other effect was that if I looked at my old exams from the 80s and the 90s, and I asked myself, is this exam a valuable exam in an environment where the students have access to information? The answer was no, because 90% of the questions you can just look up. So all that I forced my students to do actually was to memorize problems and then reproduce them on the exam. I have to work a lot harder on the quality of the assessment now in order to accommodate this new reality of access to information. But in the process, we heard a little bit about authentic learning. I want to bring in another term here, namely authentic assessment. By doing this, my assessment has become much more authentic and actually reflects much more the type of skills that we want our students and the next generation to be able to develop in order to function in society. Okay. Somebody has to watch time, because I'm afraid that unless somebody tells me, 1 minute, 2 minutes, but I think I may want to very briefly, if I may, right? Do I still have 1 or 2 minutes? Or are we out of time? Because Professor Matsushita had a list of questions on page 21 of her slides, which she addressed at me. So I think I owe you an answer to those questions. And this also brings me back to a very important point that Professor Mizukami raised early on in his talk, namely about the quality of the question, which is also the first question on page 21 of Professor Matsushita's presentation. The hard part of peer instruction is not the technology, it's not the clickers, it's not getting the students engaged. It's really two things. One is, how do you prepare the students for the class? And secondly, how do you develop good quality questions? When I first started with peer instruction, I tried to come up with all of the questions. But later on, I discovered that the right source for the questions should be the students. So I found that it was very important to connect the out-of-class component very tightly with the in-class component. What I do now is that I want my students to either watch a lecture online or read the book before coming to class, but I don't just tell them to do that, no. I tell them to communicate to me the parts that they find difficult or the questions that they have after watching a lecture or reading the book. And they basically get evaluated on the quality of those questions. And I use those questions in the classroom. So suppose you're a student, you read the text, and you think, I don't understand this. Let me type in a question about that. And then you discover that your professor will actually take your question and put it on the board. I actually project the question without the name of the students, anonymously. You'll go, wow, if I have a question, and it's a good question, he'll put it on the screen, and we'll discuss it. So I use, in the class, not the questions that come up in my mind, I actually use the questions that come up in the student's mind. Now another problem, which was pointed out by several of the previous speakers was that if you use a clicker, it has to be multiple choice, which means that coming up with the question is not enough. You have to come up with answers too. And it's very easy to come up with a question that has yes or no, or, you know, yes or no, or maybe. But that might not be very meaningful because, as Professor Matsushita pointed out, you want to reflect the misconceptions that the students have in the choices to the answers. That's one of the reasons that we developed a system that Professor Iyoshi briefly showed at the end, learning catalytics. Because learning catalytics does not require multiple choice. It can be free response, it can be graphical, it can be an equation, it can be anything. So that might be a way to improve the implementation of peer instruction in your classes, and I'd be happy to talk in more detail afterwards. I think I better stop here so we can have a more general discussion, but I really would like to thank all three of you and congratulate all three of you for those wonderful presentations. So thank you very much.